Dawn rose slowly over the Atlantic on the morning of October 21st, 1805. A pale light spread across the restless waters, and as the mist lifted, the horizon revealed a wall of ships. 33 vessels of the French and Spanish fleet stretched in a long, dark line, their sails like a forest of canvas rising against the sky. For weeks they had been gathering in the harbor of Cadiz, waiting for a moment to break free, and now they faced the sea with the promise of challenge and danger. The ocean, calm for a fleeting hour, seemed to hold within its depths the weight of Europe's future. Across the waters sailed another force, smaller in number but unshaken in spirit. The Royal Navy advanced with steady purpose, 27 ships moving in formation, their masts swaying, their decks braced for the storm to come. At their head sailed the HMS Victory, a veteran of many campaigns, her timbers scarred by salt and battle, yet strong and proud. From her mast flew the signal flag of Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, a banner recognized across the fleet, a symbol that told every sailor their leader was present among them. Nelson stood upon the quarterdeck, a figure both ordinary and extraordinary. He was not a giant of stature, his frame was slight, his step uneven. The scars of his service were written upon him. Years of battle had taken one eye and one arm, but none of this diminished the force of his presence. To those around him, he seemed anchored like a mast itself, upright against the wind, carrying in his very posture the unspoken command to endure. His men looked to him not only for orders but for strength, and in his calm gaze they found the assurance that this day, though perilous, could yet belong to them. The crew of the Victory watched as their admiral moved among them, speaking words of encouragement, offering a nod, a brief smile, a quiet remark. He carried himself not as a distant commander, but as a comrade who shared in their fate. For many, it was this closeness, this willingness to stand shoulder to shoulder, that bound them to him with devotion. The enemy's numbers might have seemed overwhelming, but in Nelson they saw a reason to believe. As the sun climbed higher, flags were raised upon the halyards, sending out a message to be carried ship by ship across the line of the British fleet. The words were simple, yet they burned with meaning. England expects that every man will do his duty. The cheer that followed rolled like thunder along the decks. Sailors who had long endured the hardships of life at sea, storms, hunger, endless watches, now felt their purpose sharpened. They were not asked to seek glory or riches, only to fulfill their duty. In those words lay the very heart of their cause, and it steadied their hands as they prepared for what lay ahead. The French and Spanish looked on, seeing a force they believed reckless. To sail directly at such superior numbers seemed a gesture of desperation. Yet, what they mistook for rashness was the mark of strategy. Nelson had chosen not to fight as custom dictated, with lines parallel, exchanging fire in endless succession. He had resolved to break through the enemy formation, to cut them apart, to sow confusion where discipline faltered. It was a gamble, one that carried grave risk, but also one that could deliver decisive victory. The sea that morning became more than water and wind. It became the stage upon which the fate of nations would turn. If the enemy succeeded, the path to England would open, and Napoleon's long-cherished invasion could follow. If the Royal Navy prevailed, the dream of crossing the Channel would vanish, and the island kingdom would rise as master of the oceans. Such stakes were not lost on those who stood upon the decks. Each man knew that the hours ahead would decide more than their own lives. Nelson himself felt the gravity of the moment. His years of command, his victories and scars, all had led him here. He carried with him not only his own hopes, but the trust of his country, the pride of a people who saw in him the shield of their nation. Yet he bore this burden without display, moving quietly among his officers, steady and composed. In that fragile stillness before the first cannon fired, history seemed to pause. The two fleets crept toward each other, the distance narrowing, the sails straining with the wind. The sea, vast and indifferent, waited to record what men would do. And at the center of it all stood Nelson, a man whose body had long been marked by sacrifice, whose spirit now shone with unbroken resolve. The story of Trafalgar began not with the crash of broadsides, but with that dawn, with a flag rippling against the sky, with a sentence carried from ship to ship, with sailors gripping their posts as the horizon filled with enemies. It began with a leader who stood unflinching, aware that his own fate was bound to the destiny of his country. Long before the smoke of battle would rise, Trafalgar had already become more than a clash of fleets. It had become the meeting of courage and duty, the moment when one man's resolve would echo far beyond the sea that stretched before him. The guns had not yet fired, but already the weight of destiny pressed upon the sea. While Nelson's fleet advanced with resolve across the waters, the struggle was not only upon the waves. Far inland, beyond the horizon of sails and cannon, another figure shaped the fate of Europe with every command he gave. For the Battle of Trafalgar was born not solely from the courage of sailors, but from the ambition of an emperor whose vision reached from Paris to the edges of the continent. After the dawn at sea, the story turns to the land, where one man held the balance of Europe in his grasp. Napoleon Bonaparte had risen from obscurity to command empires, and by 1805 his power seemed unstoppable. He had humbled Austria and Prussia, forced treaties upon kingdoms, and redrawn the map of the continent with the stroke of his hand. The victory at Austerlitz, still fresh in memory, had sent shockwaves through Europe. Armies that had once stood proudly against him now lay broken. Monarchs who had defied him now bent to his will. On land, Napoleon appeared invincible, yet one obstacle remained, an island across a narrow stretch of water. Britain stood alone, unconquered, a thorn in his vision of continental mastery. While his legions marched across the fields of Central Europe, the Channel lay like a moat, keeping him from the final triumph. To strike at Britain, Napoleon needed to command the sea, and that meant breaking the might of the Royal Navy. In Paris and at his coastal camps, he began to shape the plan. French shipyards worked furiously to restore fleets lost in earlier battles. Spanish allies were drawn into the scheme, their great galleons and crews adding weight to the armada. The idea was simple in its outline, yet perilous in its execution. Unite the French and Spanish squadrons, slip past the British blockades, concentrate in the Channel, and overwhelm the defenses guarding England's southern shores. The camps at Boulogne bore witness to this grand design. Tens of thousands of soldiers drilled along the beaches, boats prepared for crossing, supplies stockpiled for invasion. On paper, the plan promised certainty. If the fleets could clear the way, Britain would be at Napoleon's mercy. But the sea is no battlefield of his choosing. Unlike the plains of Europe, it answered not to marching columns and iron discipline, but to wind, tide, and the skill of sailors who knew its moods. Napoleon's ambition, however, did not waver. He envisioned the tricolor flying over London, the British crown humbled, and the last great rival removed. For a brief moment, it seemed within reach. The combined fleet, gathering in the harbors of Toulon, Brest, and Cadiz, waited for the chance to break free. The French emperor trusted that numbers and surprise would carry the day, and with Britain defeated, his empire would stretch unchallenged from the Atlantic to the edge of Russia. But across the Channel, Britain watched and prepared. The Royal Navy, under leaders hardened by decades of war, kept constant vigil. Every harbor where French or Spanish ships lay at anchor was shadowed by blockading squadrons. Every attempt to escape was harried, every movement tracked. It was a contest not only of ships and men, but of endurance, whether Napoleon's dream could outlast the patience and vigilance of Britain's seamen. Thus the stage was set. On the fields of Europe, Napoleon stood as master. On the waters, the question remained unanswered. His dream of crossing the Channel was not merely a military ambition, it was the symbol of his desire to claim total supremacy. Yet for all his genius on land, at sea, his fortunes rested not in his own hands, but in those of admirals and sailors who could never match the discipline of his legions. The story of Trafalgar begins here, in the shadow of a man whose ambition reached across continents, and in the tension between a dream of empire and the stubborn resistance of an island that refused to yield. Thus, the shadow of Napoleon's ambition stretched across the waters, pressing upon the narrow channel that divided empires from island. Yet, while the emperor plotted and armies drilled on the beaches of Boulogne, across that strip of restless sea, another story unfolded. Britain, small in size but vast in spirit, braced itself for the storm it knew might one day break upon its shores. The clash to come would not be born from Napoleon's vision alone, but from the tension between his dream of conquest and the island nation's determination to resist. across the channel from Napoleon's camps, the island kingdom of Britain braced itself for the storm it knew might one day come. Small in size compared to the vast empires of the continent, Britain had long depended on the sea for its survival and its wealth. Its lifeblood was commerce carried on merchant fleets that threaded across the oceans, bringing back goods from every corner of the world. Protecting those routes was the Royal Navy, a service that had become not merely a branch of defense, but the very shield of the nation. Without the Navy, Britain would stand exposed. With it, the island became a fortress rising out of the water. Yet no fortress is entirely secure when its people live under the shadow of invasion. Rumors swept through towns and villages, stories of French camps at Boulogne, of thousands of soldiers drilling on the beaches across the narrow channel. Along the southern coast, alarm bells were tested, beacons prepared, and militias drilled with muskets and pikes. Families wondered if one morning sails might appear on the horizon, carrying an army that had conquered half of Europe. The thought was enough to sow unease in a nation that had not faced the prospect of foreign invasion for centuries. The government, too, understood the weight of the moment. Ministers poured resources into coastal defenses, ordered new ships to be built, and placed garrisons where a landing might occur. Volunteers swelled the ranks of the militia. Men from farms and shops prepared to defend their villages if the French crossed the waters. It was a nation on edge, vigilant, knowing that one failure at sea could bring disaster ashore. Still, there was a paradox at the heart of Britain's anxiety. Though the threat was real, the nation's greatest strength lay in the very fear it felt. That sense of peril bound people together, sharpening their loyalty to the crown and their faith in the Navy. Newspapers printed stirring accounts of past victories. Poems and songs celebrated the courage of sailors who stood watch on distant decks. In taverns and marketplaces, the name of Nelson was spoken with pride and expectation, as if he were already the guardian of the realm. The ordinary citizens of Britain lived with both dread and determination. They tilled their fields, opened their shops, and sent their sons to sea, knowing that the fate of their island might be decided far from their sight upon the rolling waves. Their unease was not weakness. It was the recognition of how much depended on the men and ships holding the channel. For them, the Navy was not an abstract force, but the thin line between safety and subjugation. Thus, Britain became a fortress not of walls and towers, but of ships and sailors, of families willing to endure uncertainty, and of a people united in resolve. The sea, which separated them from their enemy, was both barrier and lifeline. As long as it remained under their command, the island would stand secure. But if it fell to Napoleon's fleet, the specter of invasion would become reality. In that balance, every tide and every watch on deck carried the weight of a nation's destiny. The island watched the horizon with anxious eyes. Its people braced for sails that might appear at any dawn. But the fate of Britain would not be decided by watchfires on the cliffs or muskets in village squares. It would be settled on the sea itself, where fleets already gathered in expectation of the storm. For across the waters, ships were mustering, nations were arming, and the balance of power would soon rest not on rumor or fear, but on the clash of navies. While the people of Britain watched the horizon with unease, across the waters, two fleets prepared for the trial that would decide the balance of power. On paper, the coalition of France and Spain seemed formidable. Their ships were numerous, larger in many cases than those of the Royal Navy, and their combined line promised an impressive spectacle of sails and guns. In Cadiz and other harbors, vessels stretched out in rows, their masts a forest of timber rising against the sky. To many observers, sheer numbers alone suggested that they could not be challenged. Yet beneath the surface, strength and size concealed weakness in spirit. The French fleet, rebuilt after earlier defeats, lacked the hardened discipline that only years at sea could forge. Many of their sailors had been hastily recruited, drawn not from generations of maritime tradition, but from the press of necessity. Their officers, some competent and brave, often lacked the experience of great fleet actions. The Spanish, though proud of their naval heritage, had seen their forces diminished by decades of decline, their crews worn by poor supplies and wavering morale. The result was a coalition impressive to the eye but fragile under strain, a fleet that could present a grand front, yet falter when tested by the storm of battle. The Royal Navy stood in sharp contrast. It could not match its opponents ship for ship, yet its strength did not lie in numbers. Decades of continuous war had shaped it into a force of remarkable cohesion. From admiral down to the youngest midshipman, discipline was not imposed by fear, but embedded in daily life. Sailors drilled endlessly. Gunners practiced until their movements were instinctive, and officers carried a tradition of seamanship passed down through generations. Where the French and Spanish saw unfamiliar faces on their decks, the British ships were filled with men hardened by long patrols, blockades, and battles fought in every sea. Equally important was the character of leadership. In the coalition fleet, admirals quarreled over authority, and communication between allies was strained. In the British fleet, unity of purpose reigned. Nelson had cultivated a spirit of trust among his captains, granting them freedom to act on the field, confident they understood his intentions. He called them his band of brothers, a phrase that captured both camaraderie and loyalty. This bond meant that when the moment came, British ships would not hesitate or falter. They would move with the assurance that each understood the role he must play. The difference in spirit could be seen even before the battle began. In Cadiz, the French and Spanish crews lingered in port, reluctant to face the open sea, troubled by shortages and low morale. In contrast, the British ships remained constantly on station, weathering storms and scarcity with stoic determination. The men of the Royal Navy might grumble about hard rations and cramped quarters, but they never doubted their mission. To them, the blockade was not simply duty, it was the defense of home itself. Thus the stage was set. On one side, a fleet great in number but divided in heart. On the other, a smaller force bound by discipline, tradition, and resolve. The sea would test not only the strength of wood and cannon, but the endurance of men and the quality of command. In that test lay the difference between an armada that could intimidate and a navy that could prevail. The world would soon see which of these two would hold the mastery of the waters. The contrast between the fleets could not have been sharper, one vast in number, yet brittle in spirit, the other smaller, but bound by discipline and resolve. But Trafalgar was never destined to be measured by ships alone. Beyond the rows of masts and the thunder of guns lay something greater, the struggle for the sea itself. For in 1805, the question was not only which fleet would prevail in battle, but which nation would command the lifeline of trade, security, and empire. The struggle that unfolded in 1805 was not merely a contest of armies and generals, but of oceans and the mastery of the waves. The sea had always been Britain's shield, a natural moat that guarded the island from the tides of invasion. Yet it was more than a barrier. It was the lifeline of a nation whose prosperity depended on trade. Every harbor, from London to Liverpool, bustled with ships carrying goods that fed not only Britain's economy, but also her influence abroad. Spices from the East, sugar from the Caribbean, textiles and timber, all flowed into British ports, and from those ports Britain sent forth manufactured goods and naval power in return. Control of the sea was not a luxury, it was survival. For Napoleon, the sea was a frontier he could never fully command. His genius on land was unquestioned. He maneuvered armies with brilliance, crushed coalitions, and reshaped Europe at will. But the ocean obeyed no emperor. To cross it, to challenge Britain on her own element, demanded more than soldiers drilled on parade grounds. It required fleets disciplined by salt, wind, and years of practice, qualities his navy could not match against the Royal Navy. Without command of the sea, his dreams of striking at Britain remained visions on a map, never realities on the shore. For Britain, mastery of the sea was the foundation of her entire strategy. So long as the Royal Navy held the Channel, Napoleon's armies, no matter how vast, could not march on London. So long as the trade routes remained open, British merchants could supply the treasury with the wealth needed to finance allies on the continent. The Navy was not simply a defensive shield, but an instrument of power, projecting influence far beyond the island's coasts. To lose command of the waters would have been to lose everything: security, wealth, and the means to fight. Thus, the coming clash carried significance far greater than the fate of fleets alone. It was about the balance of the world. If Napoleon broke through, the invasion of Britain could follow, and with it, the collapse of the last great opposition to his empire. If Nelson and the Royal Navy prevailed, Britain would retain her place as the mistress of the seas, free to blockade, to trade, to finance coalitions, and to shape the course of the war. The sea was the great equalizer. On land, Britain could never match the numbers of Napoleon's legions, but on the waves, where skill, discipline, and endurance outweighed sheer size, Britain could meet him as an equal, and perhaps more. Trafalgar, then, was not simply a battle waiting to be fought. It was the answer to the question of who would command the oceans, and by extension, who would hold the keys to Europe's future. And so, as fleets prepared and nations waited, the importance of the sea loomed larger than ever before. For Britain, it was existence. For Napoleon, it was the missing piece of his empire. And for history, it was the arena upon which the destiny of nations would soon be decided. The struggle for command of the sea was vast, measured in fleets and empires, yet at its heart it was shaped by individuals whose lives embodied duty and resolve. Among them, none stood taller than Horatio Nelson. To understand Trafalgar and why Britain entrusted its fate to him, the story must turn from the sweep of nations to the journey of a single man, from the roar of oceans back to the quiet fields of Norfolk, where the boy who would become an admiral first drew breath. Horatio Nelson's story began far from the roar of cannon fire, in the quiet countryside of Norfolk. He was born in 1758, the son of a village clergyman whose modest parish offered little in the way of wealth or privilege. The family lived simply, sustained by faith and duty rather than by riches. From these humble beginnings, the boy who would one day become Britain's greatest admiral first learned the values of perseverance and service. Life in rural Norfolk was not marked by grandeur. It was defined by hard work and the awareness that one's destiny was rarely chosen but earned. Nelson was slight of build, often sickly, and not expected to achieve greatness. Yet within him stirred a restless energy and a fascination with the wider world beyond the fields and hedgerows of his home. Opportunity came through family connections. His uncle, a captain in the Royal Navy, recognized the boy's determination and arranged for him to join a ship. At the age of 12, Nelson entered the Navy, stepping onto a deck for the first time as a midshipman. For a child of his background, the Navy was not only a career, but a gateway to the vast stage of the empire. The sea quickly became both a teacher and a test. As a boy sailor, he voyaged to distant waters, far from the quiet churchyard where he had grown up. In the Caribbean, he encountered climates that sapped his health but strengthened his resolve. In the icy reaches of the Arctic, he experienced the perils of storms and the endurance required to survive them. In the Indian Ocean, he learned the rhythms of monsoon winds, the patience of long voyages, and the diversity of the world that Britain's ships touched. Each voyage imprinted upon him not only the craft of seamanship, but also the conviction that the sea was his destiny. Nelson's early years at sea were not easy. He struggled with illness, often weakened by fever and exhaustion, and some doubted whether he would last in such a demanding profession. But each time adversity threatened to end his career, his determination carried him forward. He studied navigation and tactics with care, absorbed the lessons of his superiors, and displayed a courage that marked him as different from other young officers. His body might have faltered, but his will did not. There were moments when the dangers of the sea became deeply personal. During an expedition in the Arctic, Nelson joined a hunting party on the ice and narrowly escaped harm in the frozen wilderness. On another voyage, tropical fevers nearly claimed his life, yet from each ordeal he returned with greater resilience, as though hardship itself was molding him for the future that awaited. These early experiences etched into him a belief that service was not measured by comfort or ease, but by endurance and faithfulness to duty. The Navy of the 18th century was a demanding world, governed by discipline and hierarchy, but also rich with opportunities for those who seized them. Nelson's rise was not guaranteed, yet his quick mind and daring spirit set him apart. He proved adept at charting unfamiliar waters, understanding the complexities of navigation, and commanding respect even at a young age. By his late teens, he had already seen more of the world than most men would in a lifetime, and his name began to carry weight among those who recognized promise in the slight, determined youth from Norfolk. In these formative years, Nelson's character was forged. He learned that the sea could be both cruel and generous, that leadership required more than authority. It demanded trust. He also discovered within himself a quality that would later define his command: the ability to inspire others not through fear, but through example. The boy who had once seemed frail grew into a young officer whose resilience was unmistakable. Though he could not have foreseen the glories and trials to come, the path had already been set. The son of a poor clergyman, hardened by storms and illness, now belonged to the ocean, and in time, the ocean would make him immortal. The frail boy from Norfolk had grown into a young officer hardened by storms and illness, shaped by duty and endurance. Yet the sea had more to teach him. His early voyages had given him resilience, but only in battle would his true genius be revealed. As Europe plunged deeper into war and Britain's survival hung upon the Navy, Nelson's chance came. The closing years of the 18th century would see him tested in ways that no training could prepare for, and in those trials he would rise from promising officer to living legend. By the closing years of the 18th century, Horatio Nelson was no longer the frail boy from Norfolk, but a seasoned officer whose name had begun to resonate across the Royal Navy. His rise was not built on birth or wealth, but on audacity, instinct, and the willingness to risk everything in the heat of battle. 3 encounters in particular would transform him from a capable captain into the legend whose fame reached every corner of Europe: Cape St. Vincent the Nile and Copenhagen. In February 1797, the British fleet under Admiral Sir John Jervis faced the combined Spanish fleet off Cape St. Vincent. The odds were daunting. Jervis had barely 15 ships against the Spanish 27. The Spanish line stretched wide across the sea, threatening to envelop the British. In that tense moment, it was Nelson commanding the 74-gun HMS Captain who saw the opportunity others hesitated to seize. Defying convention, he broke from the line of battle without orders, steering directly toward the thick of the enemy. His ship was outnumbered and battered by fire, yet Nelson pressed forward. He led his men across the decks of the enemy vessels, boarding not 1 but 2 ships in succession. Against overwhelming odds, he captured the San Nicolas and the San Joseph, turning the tide of the engagement. Jervis later praised him, and the nation celebrated the boldness of a commander who had dared to take the fight into the enemy's very heart. At St. Vincent, Nelson's career truly took flight, but it was the following year, in 1798, that he etched his name into history with a victory so decisive that it altered the course of an empire. Napoleon had marched into Egypt, seeking to threaten British trade routes to India and to expand his dominion into the east. To secure his army, he relied upon a French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay, near the mouth of the Nile. Nelson pursued them with relentless determination. When at last he found them, he attacked at once despite the lateness of the day. Conventional wisdom dictated waiting until morning. Nelson chose instead to strike immediately. His ships slipped between the anchored French line and the shore, catching the enemy in a deadly crossfire. Hour after hour, cannon thunder rolled across the bay until the French fleet was shattered. The flagship L'Orient, pride of the French Navy, erupted in a spectacular explosion that lit the night sky. By dawn, Napoleon's lifeline was severed. The French army was stranded in Egypt, cut off from reinforcements and supplies. Nelson had not only won a battle, he had reshaped the map of war. Britain's command of the Mediterranean was secured, and Napoleon's ambitions in the east lay in ruins. Across Europe, the victory was hailed as a miracle of audacity and skill. Nelson's genius lay not only in his tactical daring, but also in his refusal to accept defeat when others hesitated. This quality shone again in 1801 at Copenhagen. Denmark, aligned with the northern powers in a league that threatened British shipping, had fortified its harbor with ships and guns. Admiral Hyde Parker commanded the British fleet, with Nelson as second in command. The battle began fiercely, the Danish line bristling with resistance. As the fighting dragged on, Parker, fearful of losses, hoisted the signal to withdraw. Nelson, aboard the HMS Elephant, raised his telescope to his blind eye and famously declared that he could not see the signal. Choosing to disobey, he pressed the attack. His determination wore down the Danish defense until at last they sued for peace. The result was not only a military victory but also a political triumph that secured Britain's dominance in northern waters. These 3 battles revealed the essence of Nelson's character. At St. Vincent, he showed the reckless courage that defied tradition. At the Nile, he displayed the strategic vision that could unmake an emperor's plans. At Copenhagen, he proved his iron resolve, unwilling to yield even when ordered to retreat. Together, they marked him as a commander apart, a man whose instincts seemed to align with the shifting fortunes of history itself. For Britain, each of these victories carried weight beyond the immediate moment. They strengthened the Royal Navy's supremacy, reassured the public that their island fortress was safe, and weakened the coalitions arrayed against them. But for Nelson, they carried another meaning. They forged his reputation as the nation's champion. His name became synonymous with daring, his figure celebrated in newspapers, paintings, and songs. Though his health remained fragile and his body bore the scars of combat, his spirit blazed with a determination that inspired all who served under him. By the dawn of the new century, Nelson was more than an admiral. He was a symbol of British resilience and audacity, the embodiment of the belief that one man's courage could shape the destiny of nations. These battles, fought across the oceans, were not isolated encounters. They were stepping stones leading to the moment when he would stand once more upon a deck, facing odds that seemed insurmountable, with the fate of Europe resting on the waves before him. That moment would come at Trafalgar, but long before the cannons thundered on that October day, Nelson's path to immortality had already been laid across the waters of St. Vincent, the Nile, and Copenhagen. The victories at St. Vincent, the Nile, and Copenhagen had carved Nelson's name into history and secured his place among Britain's greatest commanders. Yet behind the glory of triumph lay the toll of sacrifice. Each battle left its mark not only on the enemy, but upon Nelson himself, shaping him as much in body as in legend. To understand the admiral who would lead Britain at Trafalgar, one must look beyond the thunder of cannon and the cheers of victory to the scars he carried, the passions he revealed, and the humanity that made him both flawed and unforgettable. By the time Nelson had secured his place among Britain's greatest commanders, his body bore the unmistakable marks of sacrifice. He had lost the sight in one eye during the siege of Calvi in Corsica. At Tenerife, a cannon shot cost him his right arm, leaving his sleeve pinned empty at his side. Years at sea had weakened his health. Recurring fevers and ailments plagued him constantly. To the casual observer, he seemed a frail figure, thin and weathered, as though the sea itself had claimed parts of him piece by piece. Yet it was precisely these scars that deepened his aura. They told the story of a man who had given himself entirely to his calling, who endured pain and loss without surrendering his will. His physical wounds became the visible emblem of his devotion, inspiring admiration from sailors and citizens alike. For Nelson, disability never meant defeat. He moved with energy across the decks, his one arm gesturing with vigor, his voice carrying confidence even in the thick of battle. Sailors who saw him did not pity his injuries. They revered the determination that shone through them. In his presence, hardship became bearable, danger less terrifying. His frailty of body only magnified the fire of his spirit. He seemed to embody the paradox of the hero, diminished in form, yet exalted in essence. Yet Nelson was not only a figure of duty. His personal life revealed a man of deep feeling, capable of intense attachments that sometimes unsettled the conventions of his age. Nowhere was this more evident than in his relationship with Emma, Lady Hamilton, the wife of the British ambassador to Naples. When Nelson first met her after the Battle of the Nile, he was already celebrated as a hero. Lady Hamilton, famed for her beauty and charm, was captivated by him. What began as admiration soon grew into an affection that neither could deny. Their bond became one of the most famous romances of the era, both celebrated and scandalized. Nelson, already married, found in Emma a companion who understood his triumphs and his vulnerabilities. She admired not just his victories, but the man who endured so much to achieve them. In her company, Nelson allowed himself moments of tenderness, far from the rigors of command. For her, he was not merely an admiral, but a man who carried the weight of his nation and yet longed for warmth and affection. To the public, their relationship was both fascination and controversy. Society whispered of impropriety, critics condemned the liaison, but the people remained enthralled by the image of the heroic admiral and the captivating lady. In the eyes of many, their romance seemed to mirror the drama of Nelson's life, brilliant, passionate, yet tinged with tragedy. It was a love story entwined with duty, one that would never find peaceful resolution, but which lent Nelson's legend a human dimension that history seldom grants to its heroes. This combination of vulnerability and passion made Nelson profoundly relatable. He was not a distant, flawless idol carved in marble, but a man of flesh and feeling. His sailors knew him as a leader who shared in their hardships. His nation revered him as the shield of Britain, and those close to him recognized his longing for companionship. In his personal contradictions, heroic yet fragile, disciplined yet impulsive, devoted to duty yet swept by love, he reflected the complexity of the age he lived in. The figure that emerged was more than a commander of ships. Nelson had become a symbol, a man whose very life embodied the struggles of Britain at war, battered yet unbroken, flawed yet magnificent, both disciplined in battle and profoundly human in heart. The scars upon his body and the romance with Lady Hamilton did not diminish his reputation. They deepened it, making him both larger than life and achingly real. As Europe braced for the great clash that would come at Trafalgar, Nelson carried with him not only the expectations of his nation, but also the weight of his own humanity. His courage had already been proven in fire and storm, but it was his capacity for passion, resilience, and devotion that made him unforgettable. In him, the people of Britain saw not just a warrior, but the living spirit of their island, vulnerable yet indomitable, scarred yet radiant, ever ready to face the horizon with unshaken resolve. The scars upon Nelson's body and the passions of his heart revealed the man behind the legend, fragile yet radiant, wounded yet unyielding. But if these qualities made him human, it was his command at sea that made him immortal. Beyond his courage and his victories, Nelson's true greatness lay in the way he inspired those around him. To understand Trafalgar, one must see not only the admiral scarred by sacrifice, but the leader who forged a navy bound together by trust, respect, and a daring spirit unlike any other. Nelson's greatness as a commander did not rest solely upon his courage or tactical brilliance. It was also found in the way he led men. At sea, where storms and battles tested the resolve of even the hardest sailor, leadership could not be measured only in orders shouted from the quarterdeck. It had to be lived in the daily grind of discipline, hardship, and shared danger. Nelson understood this better than most, and it was here that his genius revealed itself in ways that reached beyond strategy. He was close to his sailors in a manner rare for officers of the time. The Royal Navy of the 18th century was a rigid hierarchy, and captains often kept their distance from common seamen. Nelson, however, walked the decks, speaking with his men, listening to their concerns, and treating them as comrades rather than mere instruments of war. He knew their names, their families, and their sacrifices. His presence among them built a bond of trust so deep that men who might have feared the lash of other captains instead served him with fierce devotion. In Nelson's navy, discipline did not rely on fear, it was upheld by respect. This approach extended to his officers as well. Nelson trusted his captains with remarkable freedom, allowing them to make decisions in the heat of action without waiting for rigid instructions. He believed in initiative and in empowering those beneath him to act boldly. It was not unusual for him to gather his officers before a battle, explain his intentions in broad strokes, and then leave the details to them. They called themselves his band of brothers, a phrase that captured both the intimacy and the loyalty that bound them together. In turn, they fought with a unity that no enemy could easily match. His philosophy of command was distilled in a single statement that became legendary. No captain can do very wrong if he places his ship alongside that of an enemy. To Nelson, hesitation was more dangerous than error. Action, bold and decisive, was the path to victory. He wanted his officers to act with confidence, to seize opportunities without fear of reprimand, knowing that their admiral valued courage above caution. This philosophy did not mean recklessness. It meant trust, and it instilled in his fleet a sense of initiative that proved decisive time and again. Such leadership created an atmosphere of energy and daring. In battle, the Royal Navy under Nelson moved with speed and precision, each captain anticipating the intentions of his admiral and confident that boldness would be rewarded. The result was a kind of harmony rare in naval warfare, where rigid adherence to line and order often led to stagnation. Nelson's fleet acted almost as one mind, yet each officer retained the freedom to adapt to circumstances. This combination of discipline and liberty gave the British fleet a flexibility the French and Spanish could not match. Nelson's leadership was also deeply human. He shared the hardships of his men, endured the same weather, ate the same rations, and faced the same risks. His visible wounds only reinforced this connection. Sailors looked at their admiral and saw not a distant figure, but a man who had suffered as they had, who carried his scars openly, and who still returned to the sea again and again. This bond gave his commands a moral authority that no regulation could produce. His men followed him not only because he was their superior, but because they believed in him. This style of command was revolutionary in its own quiet way. At a time when many officers ruled through severity and distance, Nelson's combination of trust, closeness, and inspiration built a force that was not only efficient, but also devoted. It was a leadership that made the Navy more than an institution. It made it a family, and within that family, Nelson stood as both leader and brother, admired not because of rank alone, but because of the spirit he embodied. In the years leading to Trafalgar, this spirit became the defining strength of the Royal Navy. Nelson's ability to forge loyalty, to encourage initiative, and to embody courage created a fleet that could stand against any odds. His style of leadership was not written in manuals or regulations. It was written in the hearts of the men who sailed with him. And it was this spirit, more than numbers or firepower, that would carry them into the battle where history itself would be decided. Nelson's gift for leadership did more than shape the men who sailed beneath his command. It shaped the spirit of a nation. His band of brothers at sea became the model of unity Britain longed for on land, as the shadow of Napoleon stretched across the Channel. While Nelson forged devotion on the decks of his ships, the people of England looked toward France with anxious eyes, bracing themselves for the storm they feared might break upon their own shores. The shadow of invasion lay heavily across Britain in the years leading to Trafalgar. On maps and in the minds of ministers, Napoleon's army seemed to loom just across the Channel, vast and disciplined, drilling endlessly on the beaches of Boulogne. To the people of England, the threat was not an abstract fear, but a daily presence. Villagers along the southern coast gazed toward France and wondered if sails might appear on the horizon at any moment. The island nation lived with the expectation that war could come not only abroad, as it so often had, but upon their very shores. Church bells, once used to call the faithful, were assigned new duties as signals of alarm. In towns and villages, beacons were prepared on hills, ready to send flames leaping skyward at the first sight of enemy ships. Local militias drilled with muskets and pikes, sometimes clumsy, sometimes resolute, embodying the determination of ordinary men who knew they might be called to defend their homes. Children heard stories of the Spanish Armada and were told that history might soon repeat itself, only with the French emperor in place of Philip II. In this climate of anticipation, the entire nation seemed to stand watch, restless and wary, their nerves stretched like ropes straining in the wind. The government responded with urgency. Shipyards along the Thames at Portsmouth and Plymouth rang day and night with the hammering of carpenters and the hiss of hot iron. New frigates and ships of the line were built, their hulls taking shape under the hands of thousands of craftsmen. The work was not glamorous, but it was relentless, driven by the knowledge that every vessel added to the fleet could mean the difference between safety and conquest. Parliament authorized funds, merchants contributed, and volunteers poured into the Navy, swelling its ranks. Training was rigorous, transforming farmers' sons into sailors, molding raw recruits into men who could endure the hardships of life at sea. Above all, Britain placed its hopes in the Navy. Unlike the militias, unlike the hastily built coastal defenses, the Royal Navy was the true wall between the nation and Napoleon. It was the fleet that had carried Nelson to glory at the Nile and Copenhagen, the fleet that kept France bottled up in port and ensured that no invasion could begin without first defeating Britain at sea. Every new ship launched, every gun fitted, every crew drilled added to that wall and at the heart of that wall stood Nelson himself. By 1805, his very name had become synonymous with the island's defense. To the people of Britain, he was no longer only a naval officer. He was the embodiment of their resolve, the figure in whom they invested their fears and their faith. His victories had shown them that genius and daring could triumph even when numbers seemed against them. His scars made him one of them, a man who had suffered for his country, as they might one day be called to suffer. To sailors, he was the admiral who knew their names and shared their hardships. To civilians, he was the hero whose courage kept the specter of invasion at bay. The press amplified this image. Newspapers printed stirring accounts of his past battles, framing him as the defender of liberty against tyranny. Poets composed verses that likened him to the knights of old, guardians of the realm who stood unyielding against foreign foes. Pamphlets circulated with stories of his boldness, his trust in his captains, his refusal to retreat even when ordered. In taverns and marketplaces, his name was spoken with pride, his deeds retold until they became almost myth. Nelson was no longer just a man. He was a symbol of Britain itself, scarred, defiant, and unconquered, the phrase that captured the nation's spirit. England expects that every man will do his duty was not yet flown at Trafalgar, but already it seemed to echo in every heart. Duty became the watchword of the time, binding rich and poor alike in the common cause of survival. The looming threat of invasion did not divide the people, it united them. Farmers worked their fields with the knowledge that their crops might feed soldiers and sailors. Merchants sent goods to supply the fleet, even at great risk. Families bid farewell to sons who enlisted, knowing they might never see them again, but proud that they served a cause larger than themselves. And so Britain waited. It was a waiting filled with tension, but also with a kind of grim confidence. For though Napoleon's armies were vast, the people believed in the navy, in their ships, and in the man who led them. Nelson became the reassuring presence in the nation's imagination, the frail figure with one arm and one eye, who nevertheless stood as tall as any fortress. When the time came, they believed he would not falter, and through him, neither would they. This spirit of vigilance and unity transformed the island. What might have been fear alone became resilience. The prospect of invasion sharpened Britain's will rather than softened it. From the hammering of the shipyards to the drilling of the militias, from the sermons in parish churches to the songs sung in alehouses, one theme ran through every effort: Britain would endure, and Nelson would lead them. By the autumn of 1805, this collective determination reached its height. Reports spread that the French and Spanish fleets were preparing to leave Cadiz. The nation held its breath. Nelson had taken command once more, and his fleet tightened the blockade. Every household in Britain felt the tension, as if the fate of the war balanced on a knife's edge. Yet even in that tension, there was pride. Whatever storms lay ahead, the island stood ready, guarded by its navy, sustained by its unity, and inspired by the man whose very presence had come to represent the soul of Britain. As Britain braced itself with vigilance and unity, eyes turned once more across the channel. For while the island stood ready, Napoleon was not idle. In his restless ambition, the emperor sought to turn Britain's fear into reality. He knew that muskets and militias on English soil would matter little if his fleets could command the sea. And so, in the harbors of France and Spain, a plan began to take shape. A plan daring in vision, perilous in execution, and destined to decide the fate of nations. Napoleon's designs upon Britain were as bold as they were perilous, and at their center lay a naval plan that he believed could tip the balance of history. His armies had triumphed on land, reshaping the map of Europe with breathtaking speed. But the narrow waters of the Channel remained beyond his grasp. The Royal Navy's blockade hemmed in his ships, confining them to ports, denying him the chance to ferry his legions across to England. To break this stalemate, he envisioned a grand maneuver. The French and Spanish fleets would escape the watchful eyes of the British, gather their strength at Cadiz, defeat Nelson in a decisive clash, and open the channel to invasion. The plan, elegant in theory, relied on timing and precision. French squadrons at Brest and Toulon would slip past British blockades, join with their Spanish allies, and concentrate overwhelming force in one place. Once massed, they would strike at the Royal Navy, sweep aside its defenders, and command the sea, long enough for barges and transports to carry tens of thousands of soldiers across to the English coast. Napoleon imagined his troops marching into London, the island kingdom humbled, its navy broken, its resistance ended. At Cadiz, the combined fleet became the linchpin of this ambition. 33 ships of the line, many of them imposing in size, waited under the command of Admiral Villeneuve. Napoleon urged him to act with speed and decisiveness. Every day spent in harbor was a day lost, a day in which Nelson tightened his grip. The emperor's frustration grew, for he understood that his empire's future hinged on momentum. Britain could not be defeated by treaties or by land campaigns. Only an invasion delivered across the waves could bring the island to heel. Yet the challenges were immense. The British blockade was not merely a line of ships, but a system of vigilance, with squadrons shadowing every move, scouts trailing every departure, and supply lines stretched to keep the enemy bottled up. Villeneuve knew that to break free would mean facing Nelson's fleet, whose discipline and skill had been proven in battles past. Even so, orders were orders, and the emperor's command left no room for hesitation. The fleet at Cadiz was not to remain idle. It was to sail, to seek battle, and to wrest control of the sea. For Napoleon, the vision was clear. A single decisive victory would shatter Britain's defenses and reshape the war. The Channel would cease to be a barrier and become a bridge for his legions. Europe's last holdout would fall, and with it, the emperor's dominance would stretch unchallenged. On parchment, the plan glowed with promise. In the cold reality of wind and tide, of ships and men, its success would depend on whether the fleets of France and Spain could match the tenacity of an island nation and the brilliance of an admiral who had never known defeat. Yet between the clarity of Napoleon's vision and the reality of the sea lay a gulf that no parchment plan could bridge. The emperor's designs demanded speed, unity, and resolve, but in the harbors where his fleets lay at anchor, hesitation and doubt held sway. At Cadiz, the grand armada that was meant to deliver conquest stood idle, its forest of masts promising power, yet its decks whispering uncertainty. At Cadiz, where the combined French and Spanish fleets lay at anchor, the gulf between Napoleon's grand vision and daily reality became painfully clear. On paper, the 33 ships of the line presented a formidable sight, a forest of masts rising above the harbor, hulls bristling with cannon. Yet within this assembly, confidence was scarce. The sea may have promised empire to the emperor, but to the men who waited in those wooden walls, it promised hardship, danger, and the likelihood of defeat. The atmosphere in Cadiz was heavy with hesitation. French officers tasked with leading squadrons rebuilt after earlier disasters knew their crews lacked seasoning. Sailors had been pressed into service quickly, many with little maritime experience. Drills were irregular, and morale flagged as the weeks stretched on. The blockade outside the harbor was a constant reminder of Britain's watchful presence. Every morning, lookouts could glimpse sails on the horizon, the British fleet waiting, patient and immovable. The knowledge that Nelson was near, his reputation towering like a shadow across the sea, weighed heavily upon the French command. Among the Spanish officers, the mood was darker still. Their once proud navy had suffered years of decline. Ships were serviceable, but often ill-maintained, their crews drawn from men weary of war and poorly supplied. Officers resented being yoked to the French, feeling their country's honor compromised in the service of Napoleon's designs. Many looked upon the coming battle with resignation rather than zeal, their spirits dulled by the sense that they were fighting, not for Spain's cause, but for another nation's ambition. Admiral Villeneuve, appointed by Napoleon to command the combined fleet, embodied the tension of Cadiz. He was no coward, but neither was he the bold leader the emperor demanded. Cautious by temperament, uncertain of his men, he hesitated when decisiveness was most needed. Rumors of Napoleon's displeasure circulated through the harbor, adding to the pressure. Villeneuve knew that to linger in Cadiz was to invite criticism, but to sail out was to risk destruction. Between the hammer of his emperor's orders and the anvil of Nelson's blockade, he found himself trapped. The daily life of the harbor reflected this unease. Crews lingered aboard their ships, going through the motions of preparation, but without conviction. Supplies dwindled, tempers frayed, and desertions grew more frequent. The once proud decks, meant to be arenas of discipline and efficiency, were instead marked by idleness and doubt. Officers barked commands, but the spirit of obedience was fragile. Spanish captains complained quietly, French commanders pressed onward mechanically, and all the while the looming question remained: could such a fleet truly stand against Nelson's? The British, blockading just beyond the horizon, understood the truth. They knew that time was their ally. Every day the Allied fleet remained confined. Discipline eroded further, supplies ran lower, and morale weakened. Nelson's genius lay not only in battle but in patience, allowing the enemy's own doubts to corrode their strength. The ships of Cadiz might have outnumbered the British, but numbers alone could not mask the divisions that cut through the heart of the fleet. Thus, by the autumn of 1805, Cadiz was a harbor filled with contradictions, ships that gleamed in the sun but carried weary hearts, officers outwardly proud but inwardly resentful, a commander burdened by orders he dared not disobey but feared to execute. Napoleon's plan depended on these ships surging forth to glory, but inside the bay, they lingered in uncertainty. Behind the high walls of Cadiz, the seeds of defeat had already been sown, even before a single broadside thundered across the sea. While doubt and division festered within the walls of Cadiz, beyond the bay another presence waited with unwavering resolve. Nelson and his fleet lay just over the horizon, silent but unrelenting, their sails a constant reminder that escape would never come easily. If the Allied armada was trapped by fear inside the harbor, it was the British who held them there, patient, watchful, and ready for the day when hesitation would give way to action. Outside the Bay of Cadiz, Nelson's fleet held its vigil with the patience of men who knew that time itself could be a weapon. His ships formed no immovable wall, but rather a living cordon, frigates and scouts spread across the horizon, great ships of the line waiting just far enough offshore to avoid the worst of coastal fire. Every movement within the harbor was watched, every change in the rigging of the enemy noted and reported. The blockade was not merely a presence, it was a constant reminder to the French and Spanish that escape could never be attempted without detection. Weeks passed in this tense stalemate. The winds shifted, sometimes carrying the scent of land out to the waiting British, sometimes pressing against their sails with maddening irregularity. Storms threatened, food grew short, and crews endured the endless monotony of watch after watch. Yet Nelson understood that endurance was as vital as battle. He reminded his captains that to maintain pressure was itself a form of combat, wearing down the spirit of the enemy even before a shot was fired. The French and Spanish might have numbers, but it was Britain that held the sea. Nelson's leadership during the blockade reflected the same qualities that had marked his career. He gave his captains freedom, allowing them to move their squadrons with initiative, confident that they understood his larger design. He encouraged vigilance without rigidity, trusting their judgment to shadow enemy movements, intercept supply ships, and prevent any attempt to slip out unnoticed. His presence, calm yet intense, reassured his men. He was not a commander issuing orders from a distance. He was a watchful guardian who shared the waiting, the discomfort, and the uncertainty. From within Cadiz, the sight of the British masts against the horizon was both infuriating and demoralizing. Each day that passed with the enemy still at anchor only increased the advantage of the blockaders. Provisions dwindled inside the harbor, while the British, though strained, received reinforcements and supplies. The imbalance of spirit grew sharper, the Allied fleet trapped and hesitant, the British steady and resolved. Nelson knew that the longer the standoff lasted, the greater his chances of victory when the enemy finally dared to emerge. The tension stretched into weeks. As fickle winds and wavering command delayed the French and Spanish departure, British lookouts scanned the waters with relentless discipline, their telescopes sweeping the horizon for any sign of sails stirring inside the harbor. Rumors circulated through the fleet. Would Villeneuve dare to break out? Was Napoleon himself pushing for immediate action? The uncertainty was sharpened by anticipation. For the British sailors, the waiting was difficult, but they bore it with the knowledge that their admiral's eye missed nothing and that their cause was just. To Nelson, the blockade was more than strategy. It was destiny drawing nearer. He felt the inevitability of battle, the moment toward which his whole life had pointed. The weeks of tension were but the gathering of storm clouds before the tempest. He knew the French and Spanish could not remain bottled up forever. When they came, he would be ready, and Britain would have its chance to decide the fate of Europe upon the waters of Trafalgar. As the horizon remained stubbornly unchanged, and the enemy lingered in harbor, the silence of waiting weighed as heavily as any cannon broadside. Nelson bore it with outward calm, but in the quiet hours aboard Victory, his thoughts turned inward. The man who watched the sea with unwavering eyes also sought the solace of ink and paper, entrusting to his letters the burdens and hopes that no blockade could contain. As the days of watchful waiting dragged on, Nelson turned not only to his charts and signals, but also to his pen. In the cabin of HMS Victory, lit by the flicker of a lantern and the steady creak of timbers, he poured his thoughts into letters. The admiral, who had faced storms and battles with unshaken resolve, revealed in ink and paper the inner man whose burdens were as heavy as his duty. To Emma, Lady Hamilton, his words carried tenderness and longing. He wrote of his devotion, of the hope that they might yet share days of peace beyond the sea and the war. But beneath the affection lay an unspoken awareness that such peace might never come. Nelson knew the risks that awaited him. Each movement of the enemy within Cadiz, each signal from the horizon, might herald the great battle he had long anticipated. To Emma he confided not only his love, but also his recognition of fate. If he were to fall, she must remember him not in sorrow alone, but in pride that he had given himself wholly to his country. To Britain, his words were those of a guardian addressing the people he served. He wrote to the government, to friends, to those in positions of power, assuring them of his commitment. Yet he also spoke to the nation in a broader sense. His language carried the weight of a vow that he would stand firm, that he would never retreat, that the fleet under his command would either prevail or perish in the attempt. "If I should fall," he declared, "remember that I have done my duty." These were not empty words for posterity. They were the distilled essence of his life, the creed by which he had lived and for which he was prepared to die. The letters reflected both his vulnerability and his strength. He did not shy from acknowledging fear or the possibility of loss, but he transformed these private admissions into public resolve. For his men, for his country, for Emma, he became the embodiment of duty fulfilled, of a life given to a cause greater than self. The same hand that gestured boldly in battle now moved carefully across the page, shaping words that would outlast him. Those who later read his letters felt the intimacy of a man who knew that destiny pressed close. They saw in them not only the admiral of legend, but the human being who loved, who hoped, who feared, and who accepted that his story might soon reach its end. Yet even in that acceptance there was no despair. Nelson wrote as one at peace with his path, certain that whatever lay ahead, he had already fulfilled his purpose. In those final days before Trafalgar, the letters of Nelson carried a dual voice, one of personal tenderness, the other of national devotion. Together, they revealed the complete man, scarred but unbroken, vulnerable but resolute, ready to meet both love and destiny with the same unflinching heart. Thus the final letters were written, words of love and duty, sealed against the uncertainty of tomorrow. And when the ink dried, Nelson turned from the page to the deck, from private reflection to public resolve. The time for waiting had nearly ended. As night fell over the Bay of Cadiz, the admiral who had confided his heart now gathered his men, ready to lead them into the dawn that would decide the fate of nations. Night settled over the Bay of Cadiz with a silence that seemed to carry the weight of destiny. On board HMS Victory, lanterns glowed softly along the decks, casting long shadows on the timbers polished by years of service. The sea outside lay restless, whispering against the hull, as if reminding every man aboard that the dawn would bring the trial they had awaited. Within the great cabin, Nelson gathered his officers. Maps were folded away, orders already given. What remained was not strategy, but spirit. There, beneath the muted sway of the ship, Nelson read aloud from the Scriptures, his voice calm, almost solemn. Around him, seasoned captains and young lieutenants bowed their heads. These were men hardened by years at sea, yet in that moment they shared something deeper than discipline or duty, a sense that the hour to which their lives had been leading was close at hand. The words of prayer seemed to rise above the creak of the decks, binding them together not only as a fleet, but as a brotherhood prepared for sacrifice. Nelson, frail in body but luminous in spirit, was not only their admiral, he was their guide into the unknown of the coming dawn. Elsewhere aboard the Victory, the mood was practical, urgent, and disciplined. In the gun decks below, sailors worked by lamplight, preparing the weapons of war with meticulous care. Cannon were swabbed and loaded with powder, shot stacked in neat pyramids ready for rapid use. Powder boys checked the cartridges, ensuring that every charge was dry and secure. Cutlasses and boarding pikes were sharpened, their edges gleaming faintly in the lantern light. The atmosphere was heavy, not with fear, but with anticipation, a quiet energy that ran through the crew as they made ready for the test they knew was inevitable. The smells of tar, rope, and gunpowder mingled in the air, familiar and strangely comforting to men who had lived most of their lives within these wooden walls. The boatswain's mates barked instructions, carpenters inspected bulkheads, and surgeons laid out their instruments with grim efficiency. Each man had his task, and each task was part of the greater whole. The ship was more than a vessel. It was a living organism, every sailor a vital part of its beating heart. On this night, the Victory was not only prepared for battle, it was prepared for history. Above deck, the stars shone bright and cold, scattered across the heavens like watchful eyes. Men leaned against the rails, gazing out across the dark sea toward the faint glow of Cadiz. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay the enemy fleet, 33 ships strong, waiting behind the harbor walls. Tomorrow, those masts would rise against them, and the calm of the night would give way to thunder. Yet for the moment, there was peace, the kind of peace that comes only before the storm. Nelson himself walked the decks before retiring, exchanging quiet words with sailors, offering encouragement, reminding them that England's fate rested in their hands, but that he had no doubt they would rise to the occasion. His presence was steady, his voice sure. To many of the men, seeing their admiral so composed was reassurance enough. If he was unshaken, then so were they. As the night deepened, the ship settled into silence. The prayers lingered in memory, the preparations were complete, and the men found what rest they could on hammocks and benches. Above them, the lantern swung gently in the breeze, casting pools of light across the decks of the Victory. Tomorrow, those decks would tremble under the weight of battle. But tonight, they carried only the quiet heartbeat of anticipation as an island nation held its breath and its greatest admiral prepared to meet the dawn. The ship fell into silence as the men sought what little rest the night could grant. Yet above the stillness, Nelson himself remained wakeful. Prayer and preparation had steadied hearts, but his own thoughts reached further, toward the dawn and the design that would shape it. For even as his sailors slept, their admiral carried within him not only the burden of command, but a plan bold enough to decide the fate of Europe. Nelson's mind, sharpened by decades at sea and battles that had tested every measure of his courage, turned in those final hours not only to prayer and preparation, but to the plan that would define him. While his men cleaned the decks and checked the guns, he gathered his captains and laid out a vision that was as daring as it was unconventional. The Royal Navy had long fought in lines, ship against ship, matching broadsides in rigid formation. Nelson intended to break that mold. He would not meet the enemy in a mirror image of tradition. He would shatter tradition itself. His design was deceptively simple yet profoundly audacious. Instead of forming a single long line parallel to the enemy, he would divide his fleet into two columns. These columns would sail directly at the Franco-Spanish line, cutting through it at right angles. By doing so, he would pierce the enemy formation, split it into fragments, and throw it into confusion. Once broken, the Allied fleet would lose the cohesion it depended upon. Nelson's ships, trained in speed, discipline, and initiative, would then envelop and defeat each isolated enemy group in turn. The risks were enormous. Sailing straight at the enemy meant exposing his ship's bows to concentrated fire before they could bring their own broadsides to bear. For precious minutes, the British fleet would advance almost defenseless, enduring the storm of shot from the Allied line. It was a gamble that might have unnerved a lesser commander, but Nelson trusted in the training of his men, the strength of their spirit, and the precision of their seamanship. He believed that once his columns broke through, the tide of battle would shift irreversibly in Britain's favor. As he spoke to his captains, Nelson's tone was neither hesitant nor severe. He laid out his plan with clarity and confidence, explaining not only what they were to do, but why it must be done. His officers listened, understanding both the danger and the brilliance of the maneuver. They knew that to follow such a plan required not just obedience, but faith. Faith in their admiral, in their ships, and in themselves. Nelson reminded them of his guiding principle. No captain could go far wrong if he simply placed his ship alongside that of an enemy. That creed, simple and direct, echoed through the room like a promise. When the meeting ended, the captains returned to their ships, carrying with them not only the details of the plan, but the conviction that it would succeed. The phrase Nelson touch, as it would later be called, was more than strategy. It was the infusion of daring into the hearts of his men. They left the gathering not with dread, but with a strange exhilaration, eager for the chance to prove themselves worthy of the trust their admiral had placed in them. On the decks of the Victory, as night wore on, the sailors sensed that something momentous had been set in motion. They could not know the intricacies of the plan, but they felt its spirit in the confidence of their officers and the quiet assurance of Nelson himself. The idea of charging straight into the enemy line was almost unimaginable, yet somehow it felt natural under his command. To them, the strategy was not madness, it was destiny. Thus, as the fleet settled into uneasy rest, the bold outline of Nelson's plan hung in the air like the stars above the darkened sea. By dawn, theory would become action, and the gamble of one admiral would decide the fate of nations. Thus, as night yielded slowly to morning, the silence that had cloaked the fleet gave way to the first stirrings of destiny. Nelson's daring plan, etched in the minds of his captains and carried in the hearts of his men, now awaited the test of battle. The calm stars above faded into the pale light of dawn, and with them the moment of theory passed into reality. Out on the horizon, sails began to rise, a forest of masts breaking from Cadiz harbor. The waiting was over. Dawn on the 21st of October broke clear and cold, the horizon painted with a pale gold light that shimmered across the swells of the Atlantic. Out of Cadiz harbor, the Franco-Spanish fleet emerged at last, their masts a forest against the morning sky, their sails filling with a steady wind. On the decks of the British ships, every man understood what this meant. The waiting was over. The storm Nelson had foretold was upon them. The two British columns moved steadily forward, their sails taut, their bows cutting through the waves with unwavering purpose. At their head, HMS Victory advanced at the forefront of one column, a single ship carrying the weight of a nation's hope. Across the water stretched the enemy line, 33 ships drawn in long array, hulls bristling with cannon, banners snapping in the wind. It was a sight of grandeur and menace, a steel wall upon the sea. Yet Nelson's men, hardened by discipline and bound by loyalty, stood firm. The calm of the night had passed. Now came the fury of day. The silence of anticipation shattered with the first thunder of cannon. French and Spanish gunners, their ships holding position, unleashed volleys as the British closed in. The sea boiled with shot, sprays of foam leaping skyward as iron tore through water and wood alike. Smoke billowed, thick and choking, drifting in clouds across the waves. The British columns pressed on, enduring the storm. Bows battered, but spirits unbroken. On the decks of the Victory, men crouched by their guns, waiting for the moment when their own broadsides could answer in kind. At last, the Victory reached the line, sailing directly into the heart of the Allied fleet. Nelson's flag bore down upon the French flagship Bucentaure, commanded by Admiral Villeneuve himself. The air grew thick with the roar of cannon, the deck trembling under the impact of return fire. Yet Victory pressed closer until the time came to swing broadside and unleash her fury. A thunderous volley erupted, crashing into the Bucentaure, splintering timbers, shattering rigging, and sending smoke and debris cascading through the morning air. The two flagships exchanged fire at point-blank range, each seeking to break the other's will. No sooner had the first broadside struck than another enemy ship closed in, the French Redoubtable. Boldly maneuvering alongside the Victory, she sought to grapple and overwhelm the British flagship. The battle tightened to brutal intimacy, hull against hull, cannon muzzles barely a stone's throw apart. Broadside after broadside erupted, deafening, relentless, as the smoke thickened until day itself seemed blotted out. To those aboard, the world shrank to sound and fury, the roar of guns, the cries of command, the crash of wood torn apart. Within the choking haze, Nelson's calm presence remained constant. He moved among his men, offering encouragement, pointing out targets, urging them onward with the steady assurance that had carried them through so many storms. To the sailors at their stations, he seemed untouchable, the living emblem of their cause. Every gun crew worked with practiced rhythm, swabbing, loading, firing, as the Victory traded blow for blow with her adversaries. The clash of the Victory Bucentaure and Redoubtable became the storm's very heart. Around them, the wider battle unfolded as the British columns burst through the Allied line, rending it into fragments. Ship after ship engaged in desperate combat, but it was at the center where Nelson's flag flew that the thunder roared loudest. The sea itself seemed to vanish beneath the smoke and flame, the horizon lost in the chaos of masts and canvas. For hours the battle raged, the sound carrying across the waves like rolling thunder. Witnesses miles away would later recall hearing it, a steady rumble as if the heavens themselves were breaking apart. On the decks, time lost its meaning. Men moved by instinct, their world reduced to the next round of shot, the next command shouted through the haze, the next shock of impact reverberating through the timbers. In that crucible of sound and smoke, destiny was being forged. The Victory, locked in deadly embrace with her enemies, embodied the spirit of the fleet. Steadfast, relentless, unyielding. As timbers splintered and the very air seemed alive with fire, the sailors of Nelson's navy held their line. The gamble of the boldest admiral in Europe was now unfolding in cannon fire and smoke, each broadside writing a new line in the fate of nations. Amid this storm of iron and flame, as the battle reached its most furious pitch, the struggle aboard HMS Victory grew ever more desperate. Locked side by side with the French Redoubtable, the fight had closed from broadsides to musket fire, the combat so near that decks and rigging blurred into a single haze of smoke. It was here, in the very heart of the tempest he had unleashed, that destiny turned its gaze upon Nelson himself. Amid the chaos of Trafalgar, as smoke rolled thick across the sea and the thunder of cannon made the very timbers tremble, fate found Nelson. The Victory, locked in deadly embrace with the French Redoubtable, was exchanging fire at the closest of quarters. So close were the ships that musketry now joined the roar of great guns. From the rigging of the Redoubtable, French sharpshooters peered through the shifting haze, their rifles trained on the deck of the British flagship, where Nelson's flag flew proudly. The admiral, in his unmistakable uniform with its brilliant stars and decorations, moved calmly along the quarterdeck, speaking to his officers and men. His presence was both reassurance and inspiration, a living symbol of steadiness amid the tempest. To those watching from the Redoubtable's mast, he was an unmistakable target. One raised his weapon, steadying it against the swaying rigging, and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out above the din, and Nelson staggered. The ball struck his shoulder, passing downward through his chest. In an instant, the men nearest to him rushed forward, catching their admiral as he fell. The deck, alive with the rhythm of battle, seemed to pause as word spread in a hushed cry. Nelson was struck. Carried below to the dim confines of the cockpit, he remained conscious, his face pale yet composed. The ship still shook with the violence of combat, guns roaring overhead, the clash of wood and iron reverberating through the decks. Amid that tumult, Nelson's first words were not of himself, but of the fight. "How goes the battle?" he asked, his voice quiet but insistent. Even in his agony, his thoughts were with his men, with the outcome upon which the fate of England rested. Those around him assured him that the day was theirs, that the enemy's line was broken and the British advantage growing. Nelson listened intently, his lips tightening into the faintest of smiles. He seemed less concerned with his own wound than with the certainty that his great gamble had succeeded, that his fleet was prevailing. To his officers and surgeons, he whispered that he felt the wound was mortal, but there was no despair in his tone. His spirit, forged in decades of service, accepted what his body could no longer withstand. Above him, the battle raged on with unrelenting fury, but below decks, in that cramped and shadowed space, history paused. Here was the man who had carried Britain's hopes across oceans, now brought low by a single shot. Yet even in that moment, he remained every inch the admiral. His composure steadied those around him, his questions about the fight reminding them that duty was larger than life itself. As the minutes stretched into hours, Nelson continued to ask for news, eager for confirmation that the fleet held its ground, that victory was assured. Each report brought him peace, as though each success on the surface was another step toward fulfilling the destiny he had long foreseen. The roar of Trafalgar still thundered above, but for Nelson the sound was no longer chaos. It was triumph. Above deck, however, the storm could not pause for a single man, even for Nelson himself. While he lay below in the dim light of the cockpit, the battle still roared with undiminished fury. The enemy line was breaking, but the outcome was not yet secured. In that crucible, command passed to the man Nelson had long trusted as both comrade and second, Vice Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood. While Nelson lay below deck, his life ebbing slowly away, the battle above raged with unrelenting force. The mantle of command fell to Vice Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood, Nelson's trusted friend and second in command. Collingwood, aboard HMS Royal Sovereign, had already hurled himself into the fight with fearless energy, his ship smashing through the enemy line at the opposite end of the battlefield. Now, with Nelson incapacitated, it was Collingwood who bore the responsibility of carrying the plan to its conclusion. He did so with steady resolve. The strategy Nelson had set in motion was already unfolding, and Collingwood ensured its momentum never faltered. His voice, calm yet commanding, carried across the din as signals were hoisted and orders relayed. The British fleet, drilled in initiative and bound by trust, moved as if Nelson's spirit still guided them from above. One by one, the French and Spanish ships found themselves isolated, their line torn apart by the relentless thrust of the two British columns. The chaos of battle turned inexorably against the Allies. The French flagship Bucentaure, battered and surrounded, was forced into submission. The proud Spanish Santa Ana fought valiantly, but was overpowered, its decks shattered, its colors struck. Around the battlefield, ships once proud and resplendent were reduced to drifting hulks, their masts toppled, their crews surrendering. Some caught fire, columns of smoke rising like funeral pyres into the sky. Others attempted to flee, but British frigates pursued with relentless determination, cutting off every escape. Amid the tumult, Collingwood's steady leadership anchored the fleet. He urged his men onward, his confidence never wavering, even as the decks quaked beneath the weight of broadsides. To the sailors who fought under him, Collingwood embodied the same unshaken will as Nelson. Together, admiral and fleet seemed to speak with one voice. Britain would not yield. Britain would prevail. For the Allied fleet, the battle became a nightmare of disintegration. Discipline collapsed. Coordination was lost. Signals from ship to ship went unheeded as smoke and fire consumed the line. Captains fought bravely, but without unity, their efforts dissolved into fragments of resistance. The grand design of Napoleon's invasion, built on the hope of breaking Britain's sea power, crumbled wave by wave, broadside by broadside. By the time the sun dipped lower in the sky, the result was beyond doubt. 18 enemy ships had been captured or destroyed, their flags hauled down as the Union Jack flew triumphant. The sea, once dominated by the imposing line of the Franco-Spanish Armada, now bore witness to wreckage and surrender. The Royal Navy, battered but unbroken, stood master of the waters. Collingwood, exhausted but resolute, surveyed the scene from the quarterdeck of Royal Sovereign. His heart, heavy with grief for Nelson, was nonetheless lifted by the magnitude of the victory. He knew that Trafalgar was more than a battle won. It was a turning point in history. The invasion of Britain was broken. Napoleon's ambitions at sea shattered forever. From that day, the island nation would reign unchallenged upon the waves. Yet even amid triumph, the cost was felt. Word passed through the fleet of Nelson's mortal wound, and joy mingled with sorrow. The men cheered their victory, but their cheers carried the weight of mourning. For though the fleet had triumphed, its greatest admiral lay dying below. Still, the outcome was secure. Collingwood, steady as the tide, brought order to the shattered field, organizing the captured ships, tending to the wounded, and guiding the fleet through the storm's aftermath. Trafalgar was theirs, won by Nelson's daring, sealed by Collingwood's resolve, and carried by the courage of every sailor who had stood firm that day. Yet even as Collingwood steered the fleet to triumph, the heart of the victory beat faintly below decks. Wild cheers echoed across the sea, and enemy colors fell one by one. Nelson lay beneath the guns of victory, his body failing even as his plan succeeded. The fate of the battle was secure, but the fate of its architect was slipping away. Below the decks of HMS Victory, far from the thunder of the guns above, Nelson lay in the dim light of the cockpit. Lanterns swayed with the motion of the ship, casting wavering shadows across the faces of the surgeons and officers gathered around him. The sounds of battle still shook the timbers. Cannon fire shouted orders, the grinding clash of ships locked together. But here, in this cramped and shadowed space, the Admiral's world was narrowing to its final moments. He remained composed, though pale, and clearly weakening. Those who knelt beside him were struck not by fear in his eyes, but by serenity. Nelson spoke in fragments, his breath shallow, yet his words revealed the clarity of a man who knew that destiny was close. Again and again he asked after the battle. Reports reached him that the enemy line was shattered, that ship after ship was surrendering, that Collingwood was pressing the fight to its conclusion. Each message seemed to ease the weight upon him, bringing a faint smile to lips that had so often given commands with unshakable certainty. Around him, officers tried to keep their composure, masking grief with duty. They knew that they were witnessing not only the death of a man, but the passing of an age. To Britain, Nelson was more than flesh and blood. He was the embodiment of its defiance, its shield against conquest. And now, in the silence between the thunder above, he prepared to leave them. As his strength ebbed, Nelson whispered words that have since echoed through history. "Thank God I have done my duty." It was both prayer and farewell, a simple declaration that distilled the essence of his life. He had given all he had to the sea, to his men, to his country. He had fulfilled the creed that had guided him from the moment he first set sail as a boy. In those words lay the sum of his service, his sacrifice, and his triumph. The hours stretched, the lantern light dimmed, and still the battle raged overhead. But gradually, the news that filtered below became unmistakable. The Allied fleet was broken. Captured ships floated under British colors. Others burned or fled. Trafalgar was won. When the final confirmation was brought to him that the enemy had been utterly defeated, that Britain was safe, Nelson's eyes brightened with one last spark of joy. He had lived long enough to know that his plan had triumphed, that his nation would endure. Those present saw his lips curl into a faint smile. His chest rose one last time, and with quiet dignity, he breathed his final breath. The noise of the battle thundered on, but to Nelson the fight was finished. He had carried his duty to the end, and in that knowledge, he passed into eternity. Above, the Union Jack still flew from the shattered masts of the Victory. Smoke rolled across the sea, mingling with the cries of triumph and the groans of the defeated. Amid Victory's tumult, the men of the Royal Navy soon learned that their leader was gone. Their cheers fell into silence, grief mixing with pride. Nelson was no longer with them, but his spirit lingered, woven into the very waves he had commanded. Thus ended the life of Britain's greatest admiral, not in quiet retirement, but in the heart of battle, at the moment of his greatest triumph. Trafalgar secured the seas for Britain, but it also sealed the legacy of the man who had delivered it. Nelson's death was mourned across the nation, yet his words remained as a beacon. Duty fulfilled, destiny embraced, a life given wholly to country and cause. Above the silence of his passing, the guns still thundered, carrying forward the battle he had set in motion. And when at last their echoes faded and the smoke drifted seaward, what remained was both grief and glory. A fleet victorious, a nation saved, and a world forever changed. The guns finally fell silent as the smoke of Trafalgar drifted away across the sea, leaving behind a battlefield of shattered timbers, broken masts, and drifting wrecks. When the tally was made, the scale of the triumph became undeniable. The Royal Navy had lost not a single ship, though many were battered and scarred. The enemy, by contrast, had seen 22 ships destroyed or captured. What had begun as Napoleon's bold attempt to seize mastery of the Channel ended in utter ruin. For the sailors of Britain, the result was both awe-inspiring and sobering. They had endured hours of relentless combat, seen their admiral fall, and yet emerged with a victory so overwhelming that it changed the balance of the war. On the decks of the surviving British ships, weary men looked across the waters at the defeated enemy, scarcely able to believe what their courage and discipline had achieved. The wreckage of the Franco-Spanish fleet testified not only to their skill, but to the audacity of Nelson's plan. News of the outcome spread quickly. To the men of the fleet, the realization that they had crushed the combined naval power of France and Spain was almost beyond comprehension. To Napoleon, waiting far away for word of his fleet's success, it was a disaster of historic proportions. His dream of crossing the Channel, of landing his legions on English soil, dissolved with the smoke of Trafalgar. No longer could he hope to challenge Britain at sea. His armies would continue to dominate Europe on land, but the sea was lost to him forever. In the harbors of France and Spain, despair replaced pride. Families waited for ships that would never return, and the tricolor and the Spanish ensign were lowered in defeat. The alliance that had promised so much had ended in catastrophe. The Channel, once imagined as a bridge for Napoleon's invasion, remained an unbroken barrier, guarded by Britain's wooden walls. For Britain, the victory was more than a single battle won. It was a turning point, a safeguard of the nation's independence. From that day onward, the threat of invasion receded. The people of England, who had lived in fear of French sails appearing on their horizon, could now breathe freely. Trafalgar secured their island, preserved their sovereignty, and ensured that the Royal Navy would dominate the seas for generations to come. Yet the victory was bittersweet. The fleet exulted in its triumph, but the loss of Nelson tempered their joy. He had given his life at the moment of greatest success, his final breath entwined with his final victory. For the men who had fought under him, the sight of captured enemy ships lining the horizon was a monument not only to their strength, but to the admiral who had led them there. Trafalgar's outcome reverberated far beyond the waters of Spain. Across Europe, allies and enemies alike understood its meaning. Britain's command of the sea was absolute, and Napoleon would never again threaten her shores. The war would continue. Battles would rage across continents, but the invasion of England was no longer possible. Nelson's triumph, won at such cost, had reshaped history. As the sun set on that fateful day, the wreckage of 22 enemy ships scattered across the waves told the story more eloquently than words. Britain had stood firm, had prevailed, and had secured its destiny as mistress of the seas. For Napoleon, Trafalgar was the end of a dream. For Britain, it was the beginning of an age. Yet even as the wreckage drifted across the waters and the Union Jack flew in triumph, Trafalgar's meaning was only beginning to unfold. What had been decided in smoke and thunder off the coast of Spain now began its second life, in news carried homeward, in stories whispered and shouted, in a legacy that would shape nations as surely as the battle itself. The news of Trafalgar traveled faster than sails could carry, borne on the tongues of sailors, the dispatches of officers, and the awe of all who heard it. Across the seas, in Britain, in France, and throughout Europe, the echoes of the battle reverberated like the tolling of a great bell. Trafalgar was not merely another clash in a long war. It was the moment the future bent toward one path and away from another. For Britain, the relief was profound. The specter of invasion that had hung over the island for years dissolved with the smoke of Trafalgar. Villagers who had built beacons on hillsides, who had listened for the alarm bells that would summon them to defend their homes, now found themselves safe. The Channel, so often imagined as a vulnerable frontier, was proven to be the moat of an unconquerable fortress. When news of Nelson's victory reached London, bells pealed across the city, crowds surged through the streets, and prayers of thanksgiving filled churches. The nation rejoiced, even as it mourned. For though Trafalgar had delivered security, it had claimed the life of the man most responsible for it. Word of Nelson's death spread with the victory, turning triumph into something richer, more complex, and more enduring. A cheer rose for the safety of Britain, but tears fell for the admiral whose final breath had been given to ensure it. In taverns, marketplaces, and homes, the story was told and retold, how Nelson had struck down the enemy, asked about the fate of his fleet, and died content, knowing his duty was fulfilled. It was a tale that entered the bloodstream of the nation, shaping its memory for generations. Parliament moved swiftly to honor him. Nelson's body was brought back to England in solemn procession, carried not by circumstance, but by reverence. Preserved in a cask of brandy for the journey, he returned as a fallen hero, born not in life, but in legend. When his funeral took place in St. Paul's Cathedral, the nation turned out to witness it. Tens of thousands lined the streets of London, their faces somber, their eyes fixed upon the cortege that carried him through the heart of the capital. Inside the cathedral, the grand dome echoed with hymns as his coffin was lowered into the crypt where kings and conquerors lay. Nelson joined them, not as a monarch, but as something rarer, a man of the people elevated by his deeds into the pantheon of immortality. For Napoleon, the news struck like a thunderbolt. The emperor, master of the land, whose armies had marched from Lisbon to Vienna, found himself humbled upon the sea. Trafalgar was not merely a defeat, it was the closing of a door. His dream of crossing the Channel, of bringing Britain to its knees, was gone forever. He turned his ambitions eastward, toward the heart of Europe, and in time to Russia. But never again did he dare imagine that Britain could be conquered by water. Trafalgar had drawn an unbreakable line. The land might fall to Napoleon, but the sea belonged to Britain. The legacy of Trafalgar was measured not only in ships lost or battles won, but in the shaping of an age. With Napoleon's invasion plan shattered, Britain's island fortress stood secure, free to wield its naval supremacy as both shield and sword. The Royal Navy became the unchallenged master of the oceans, ensuring that British trade, influence, and empire could expand across every horizon, from the Caribbean to the Cape. From India to Australia, the sea lanes carried not only goods, but ideas, authority, and the unshakable presence of Britain. Trafalgar had been fought off the coast of Spain, but its consequences stretched across the globe. At home, the victory infused Britain with a sense of destiny. The loss of Nelson deepened rather than diminished the power of the triumph. His name became inseparable from Trafalgar, and Trafalgar inseparable from Britain's identity. Songs were written, statues raised, poems composed. In London's Trafalgar Square, a towering column would one day rise, crowned with his likeness, gazing out over the city he had saved. His signal, "England expects that every man will do his duty," became a creed, repeated in times of trial as both command and comfort. Yet the legacy was not solely one of triumph. Trafalgar reminded Britain of the cost of greatness. It was a battle won with sacrifice, a victory sealed with the death of its brightest star. For every captured ship, there were men who did not return. For every cheer, there was mourning in villages and harbors. The sea had given Britain safety, but it had taken its toll. This duality, the joy of survival and the sorrow of loss, gave Trafalgar a depth that made it more than a military event. It was a national experience, shaping the character of a people. In France and Spain, the memory was one of humiliation. For the Spanish, who had once ruled the greatest empire the world had known, Trafalgar marked the eclipse of their naval power. For the French, it was a bitter reminder that their emperor, brilliant on land, was vulnerable at sea. The sailors who survived carried tales of British discipline and daring back to their ports, tales that underscored the futility of challenging an enemy so thoroughly in command of the waves. For Europe as a whole, Trafalgar signaled that the struggle against Napoleon would be fought on land alone. Britain's navy would continue to project power, funding coalitions, transporting armies, and enforcing blockades. But the threat of a French invasion of England, so long a looming shadow, was gone. In its place stood a certainty. As long as the Union Jack flew upon the sea, the island kingdom would endure. Over the years that followed, Trafalgar's legacy only grew. Every new battle Britain fought upon the waves, every convoy protected, every enemy fleet blockaded, was seen as an echo of that great day. Nelson's tactics, his daring, his insistence on initiative and trust, shaped naval doctrine for generations. Admirals who came after him studied his decisions, his writings, his signals, seeking to capture a fragment of the genius that had secured Britain's maritime supremacy. Trafalgar became not just a memory, but a school of war, a guide for those who would follow. And in the hearts of the British people, Nelson became more than human. He was transformed into myth, into a figure who embodied not only the victory at Trafalgar, but the very spirit of resistance against tyranny. His flaws, his humanity, even his scandals were eclipsed by the brilliance of his final act. In death, he was perfected, frozen forever in the moment of triumph. The man who gave everything at the hour of need. Even today, Trafalgar remains a point of reference, not only for sailors and historians, but for anyone who seeks to understand how a single day can shape centuries. It was the day Britain's place as mistress of the seas was assured, the day Napoleon's vision of a Europe united under his hand was confined to land. It was the day when duty, sacrifice, and destiny converged upon the waters of Spain, and from that convergence, a new world order emerged. The echoes of Trafalgar did not fade with the smoke. They carried through time, into the halls of empire, into the hearts of generations who would face wars of their own. Whenever Britain stood upon the brink, the memory of that October morning, of Nelson's words and Nelson's sacrifice, returned to guide them. Trafalgar was not only a victory of ships and guns, it was a victory of spirit. It was proof that courage, discipline, and unity could defy even the mightiest of foes. Thus, Trafalgar endures. It endures in monuments and memorials, in the lessons of strategy and leadership, in the very rhythm of Britain's national story. It endures in the phrase that Nelson gave them, "England expects," a phrase that outlived him, outlived the battle, and outlived the century. Trafalgar was his triumph, but it became the nation's inheritance, a legacy that defined not only an age of war, but the identity of an island people whose fate was forever tied to the sea. And so Trafalgar moved beyond the realm of history and into the realm of memory. What began as smoke upon the sea became stone upon the land, carved into monuments and carried in the daily life of a nation. The echoes of that October day did not fade with time. They found form in the heart of London itself, where the story of Nelson and his final victory was raised skyward in marble and bronze. The story of Trafalgar does not end upon the waters where cannon smoke drifted into the Spanish sky. It lives on, carried across centuries, etched into stone and memory alike. Today, in the heart of London, Trafalgar Square stands as the nation's monument to that fateful October day. Rising above the bustle of the city, Nelson's column stretches skyward, crowned with the figure of the admiral who gave his life at the moment of greatest triumph. Around its base, bronze reliefs tell the tale of his battles, while fountains play and pigeons circle in the air. Tourists gather, cameras in hand, gazing upward, not merely at a statue, but at a fragment of history made flesh and stone. To look upon Nelson, there is to look upon memory itself, a memory shared by millions who never saw the sea, but who inherit the freedom secured upon it. The square is more than a landmark. It is a stage upon which Britain remembers itself. The traffic of a modern city flows past, yet in the stillness of the monument there lingers the sound of sails, the crash of waves, the thunder of distant cannon. Children play at the foot of the column, their laughter mingling with the echo of history, while veterans pause in silence, hats removed in quiet respect. Each visitor, whether they know the details of Trafalgar or not, feels something of its weight. They look up at the solitary figure of Nelson and sense that here stands not just a man of marble, but the embodiment of an ideal that, duty when fulfilled, leaves behind a legacy stronger than stone. For Trafalgar was not simply a battle, it was the opening chord of what would come to be called the Century of Britain. With the seas secured, the island kingdom embarked upon an age of expansion and influence that reached across the globe. From the shipyards of Portsmouth to the harbors of India, from the markets of the Caribbean to the coasts of Africa, Britain's reach was defined by the navy that Trafalgar had assured. Empire, commerce, culture, all rode upon the waves, safeguarded by Nelson's final victory. Yet Trafalgar's legacy is not measured only in the language of empire. It is measured in the story of one man whose life came to symbolize a nation's resilience. Nelson was scarred, weary, and mortal, yet his spirit burned with a brightness that outlasted his years. His final words, "Thank God I have done my duty," echo still, not as the farewell of a dying man, but as a creed for the living. They remind generations that duty, however small or great, binds individuals to causes beyond themselves. In that sense, Nelson did not die at Trafalgar. He became immortal, his name inseparable from the sea, his sacrifice inseparable from the freedom it secured. The pigeons wheel around the column, the fountains sparkle in the sunlight, and life in London flows ever onward. Yet Nelson remains, unmoving, unforgotten, the sentinel of an age when Britain's fate was decided by wooden ships and iron will. Visitors lift their eyes to him as though to lift their eyes to history, and in that upward glance lies the recognition of something timeless. Trafalgar was a moment, but its echo became an era. Nelson was a man, but his example became eternal. Thus the tale closes where it began, upon the sea, upon the idea that a single life, given wholly to duty, can shape the destiny of nations. Trafalgar was not just a clash of ships and men. It was the birth of a legacy, the dawn of a century in which Britain's star would rise over the oceans. Nelson fell, but in falling he rose higher than any monument could lift him. His column in Trafalgar Square is not merely a stone tower. It is the nation's reminder that greatness is not found in conquest alone, but in sacrifice, in vision, and in the simple truth of his final words, "I have done my duty." And yet, Trafalgar's echo does not end in London's stone or memory. It lingers where it began, upon the restless sea, for the sea is never still. Waves rise and fall, winds shift, horizons change. Yet amid that eternal motion, some moments endure, fixed like stars above the waters. Trafalgar was such a moment. On that October day in 1805, when Britain's fate trembled on the edge of uncertainty, courage and duty forged a path that would shape a century. The sea is never still. Waves rise and fall, winds shift, horizons change. Yet amid that eternal motion, some moments endure, fixed like stars above the waters. Trafalgar was such a moment. On that October day in 1805, when Britain's fate trembled on the edge of uncertainty, courage and duty forged a path that would shape a century. Nelson's life ended in the thunder of battle, but his story did not sink with him. It carried forward in every ship that sailed under the Union Jack, in every generation that looked to the sea for strength, in every voice that repeated his words, "I have done my duty." To speak them is to remember that duty transcends time, that sacrifice is never wasted, that honor endures beyond death. Today the waves wash, as they always have, against the cliffs of England, steady and unyielding. Ships still cross the channel, as they did in Nelson's day, but the invasion that once threatened never came. Trafalgar saw to that. The admiral who gave his life ensured that the island he loved would remain free, that its people could chart their own course across the coming century. And so Nelson remains, etched not only in marble and bronze, but in the story of a nation and the memory of the world. The sea may forget the smoke and the thunder, but it remembers the spirit of the man who mastered it. His column rises over London, but his legacy rises higher still, borne on every tide that carries the echo of Trafalgar. For as long as waves break upon the shore, the name of Nelson will not fade.